Coming up, how crowdsourcing failed in the Boston bombing investigation, CISPA and the threat to your internet privacy, why Google doesn't want you reselling Google Glass, and why China needs a porn officer. All that and more on this episode of Downloaded. Welcome to Downloaded, the show where we gather the most opinionated voices in the tech field today and focus that energy on the stories impacting the tech world. Hello, I'm your host, Bob Suicide. And joining me today is Iain Thomson, reporter for The Register, and Rebecca Jeschke, Media Relations Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Welcome to the show. Thanks.
Thank you.
So let's just jump into our first story here. The Boston bombing, it's a terrible event. In the aftermath, authorities were quick to use the crowd as a source to gather intel on possible suspects behind the explosions. But can a digitally connected crowd source population be a legitimate resource for authorities, Rebecca?
Well, it's a really interesting question in that, people were asked for their SIM cards and video to be sent to the police. It's still not clear to me how they actually were able to access all that crowdsourced information. It sounds to me like, although we're only hearing bits and pieces, that the video that they actually used was from a surveillance camera from a department store. So it is hard to imagine how they could index all that information quickly. I think the most interesting aspect of it is it's the DVRization of our lives. It's like our whole lives can be paused and rewound in the middle of these networks of all these cameras. It's a major sea change in how we live our public lives, that we can be caught on camera throughout the day. And clearly there's some good uses for this, but we need to consider also, I think, what the bad uses are for it. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you do that are legal and private, where you get healthcare and such.
Indeed, I should imagine the authorities will be going through the mobile phone accounts of these two people who've been accused of the bombing and really backtracing for the last sort of month, year or whatever, taking into account which cell tower the mobile was using so you can try and get it on location, any GPS data they can get, and of course social networks and the camera footage that you mentioned.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that when you start searching somebody's phone, you're not getting just their communications, you're getting all the communications of people who talk to them, and you need to think about their privacy as well, because there'll be some non-important stuff in there.
So that's a really interesting point. I mean, is there a danger on relying too much on crowdsourcing as a source of information?
Well, I mean, I think we've all seen some dangers recently. I mean, I think crowdsourcing the investigation has been extraordinarily problematic. People have been named as suspects who wouldn't be. I mean, this is something that you actually need professionals to do.
This is it. I mean, crowdsourcing can be immensely useful in the right circumstances, but when it's some kind of online lynch mob like you saw from 4chan or Reddit, then it becomes actively counterproductive. Crowdsourcing works very well when it's organized. Look at Wikipedia as a great example of that. But in terms of I was watching it coming up on 4chan and Reddit, it was largely supposition, and there was no organization to it. It was just someone saying, "Oh, that person in that camera is has a black rucksack on their back, which looks heavy. Let's say they're a bomber."
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, it just struck me as flat out cocky. I mean, there are a reason why you have trained police officers and trained investigators. And there are things that for crowdsourcing works really well. But I think this is a situation where people needed to step back and say, do I have the knowledge that's necessary to be able to do this extraordinarily important thing with huge ramifications?
And I don't want to be too harsh on Reddit and 4chan either. I mean, look at the New York Post and the kind of headlines that they were running was shockingly bad. The whole job of journalists is to filter out this kind of stuff and not to pander to it. And as I say, it was quite shocking to see that on the front page with no evidence whatsoever.
I actually think it's a really good time for everybody to sort of evaluate what sources they trust online and why. And maybe they shouldn't be trusting those sources either. I mean, everyone needs to learn how to read news stories, whether they're in the New York Times or a blog post from a friend, with a critical eye. And this is a great example of why that's important.
So how can we balance the needs of law enforcement without having people go overboard like the New York Post?
I've got to say, I was thinking about this over the last evening. What you could do is use the resource of people that you've got in somewhere like Reddit and 4chan to analyze photographs so that the police could take a collection of photographs which need to be gone through and crowdsource that out in a secure format. It would take an awful lot of sort of working out the odds and ends, and I'm not sure what the privacy angle would be, but it might be handy.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because there are privacy implications here, and there are also free speech implications. I mean, people should be able to talk about the news of the day and how it affects them. They should be able to share their theories even. I mean, there are free speech implications here. I mean, this is sort of the first time we've ever seen something like this.
Do you think that future criminal investigations will rely more on this sort of crowdsourcing with cell phones and media, considering they're more reliable than eyewitnesses? Do you think that this is...
Yeah, I kind of hope not, to be honest,
Really?
because there's nothing so unreliable as an eyewitness. Any lawyer will tell you that it's just like eyewitness testimony can be wrong so often. I think there is certainly a role to play. Twitter showed very quickly in the first 5 minutes of the attack its immense value in terms of getting information out there. But for the next 12 and 24 hours, it showed its big weakness, which is just this deluge of wrong information.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to be really interested to see in the next several weeks, and that's the thing, we're going to have to wait, how the investigation played out. What was the useful information and what wasn't the useful information? I guess I wouldn't be surprised, although, you know, it's hard to know, I wouldn't be surprised if the crowdsourcing video was too much for the police to even be able to see and analyze. But I think it will be interesting to see what's helpful to them and what's not helpful, because truthfully, that's going to explain what and foretell what's going to happen in the future.
Speaking of crowdsourcing, our next story, activist hacking group Anonymous has launched a citizen journalism website called Your Anon News. Ian, is this a good thing?
I'm mixed. I think actually it is a good thing on a lot of levels. Opening up the sort of the media stream to new voices is always very important. I'm slightly concerned, given Your Anon News's record this week, where they announced that the Westboro Baptist Church Facebook page had been hacked, when in fact it looks very much just like simple brandjacking rather than hacking. But if it's done right, it could be good. But as I say, just opening up and saying, right, anyone write whatever they think is news without any checking or fact-checking particularly, I think it's a tricky move. We'll see how it bears out. I mean, as I say, promising, but what are your feelings?
Well, you know, it's always interesting when you get to citizen journalism, right? I mean, that one of the powers of the internet is that that people don't need, they don't need to impress the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
You know, Revision 3 can be on the internet and people can see it. You don't need to be blessed by, you know, a major corporation in order to get the word out. This is great. This is wonderful for free speech, but it does increase the need for viewers, readers, to read and interpret information with a critical eye. Exactly, you know, what I was talking about before.
Yeah.
So can this sort of citizen journalism be as trustworthy as the mainstream media that we come to know?
On the whole, perhaps not, because you do have professional reporters and professional editors who know, you know, if you're not the Post, know when to publish a name and when not to publish a name of a suspect. You know, these are people who, you know, when I was, you know, a producer for CBS, you know, I went to ethics training. We talked about
I've had long legal classes as well, and they're intensely boring and very valuable.
And really important to talk about that. So, you know, there's a reason why people are professional journalists and professional editors. On the other hand, those people get old and set in their ways, and you know, you often see a citizen journalism piece that really breaks news.
Yes.
And I heard you grumbling.
Well, yes, you're right. There are some great examples of citizen journalism doing a fantastic job, but. And no, of course, I would say this, wouldn't I? But you do need professional journalists there to act as a filter, to act as not as a gatekeeper, but just somebody who can spot what is slightly dodgy about a story, what might not be right. Because at the end of the day, you are writing about people's lives, and if you get it wrong, then it can have a major impact. I mean, citizen journalism I'm fine with, so long as it's responsible journalism which the person who's writing it is prepared to take responsibility for. Just splashing something up and saying, this is my free speech right to say this, I disagree with.
If Anonymous were to post a story that turns out to be false, is there any sort of accountability for reporting?
You know, there are interesting questions about that. I think, you know, certainly if they are building it the way that I understand it, which is that people can contribute the same way they might to a bulletin board or some sort of group blog, or comments to a blog, then the host is not necessarily legally responsible for things that people say online. It's Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It's bedrock free speech law in the US. The idea is you don't hold the soapbox liable for what the speaker says. It's very important because if you didn't have a law like that, you wouldn't be able to allow comments on your blog because someone might say something, or Craigslist wouldn't exist. So, as for the structure of the internet, Section 230 is something that, EFF works to protect every day because it's so important. That doesn't mean, of course, that no one's responsible if somebody libels somebody, if somebody defames somebody, invades their privacy, under state law. But the idea is you go after the speaker, the person who wrote it, and not the forum itself.
And speaking of accountability, CISPA was recently passed in the House of Representatives. The Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act would allow for the sharing of internet traffic information between the US government and certain technology and manufacturing companies. So, what's wrong with this act?
There are quite a few things that are in turns to me.
How long have we got?
There are quite a few things that are wrong with what was passed in the House this week. It's the sharing part. The S of CISPA, the sharing part is the really big problem. It opens up this huge hole in privacy law in the US. It basically allows communications providers to pass over personally identifiable information and communications to the US government, and possibly use those, at least in the House version right now, possibly use those for national security issues, or anything else. I mean, normally that's why we have privacy law, is to make sure that, your phone provider, your internet provider can't spy on what you do.
Yeah, it seemed really interesting to me that their way around that sharing was that they said that it was optional, and that was somehow okay.
Optional with inverted commas. I mean, come on, if the US government comes to you and says there's a cybersecurity threat, we need the information on this user, and this user, and if you don't give it, maybe it might leak out to the media. What a shocking thing that would be. I mean, I've heard stories of just that kind of thing going on.
Well, but also it really requires people to, employees to become security experts, which they may not be. I mean, they're supposed to, decide what traffic is, or what communications are critical and what is weird, and they're the ones that they're making these decisions about whose privacy is going to be invaded. That's what seems. I mean, I'm sure that there are a ton of people who will take that responsibility extraordinarily seriously and do a great job with it. But what about the one guy that doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a similar bills to this, in some ways called RIPA in the United Kingdom, and it was originally billed as this is an anti-terrorism measure, this will keep us safe, and now local councils are using it to find out who's been speeding or parking offences or stuff like that. It's the mission creep in something like this is what's really dangerous. There is some good stuff in CISPA in terms of codifying the sharing of security threat information between government and business, but in terms of the massive grab bag of information that you could get on very flimsy terms, it's immensely worrying.
Yeah, I was really worried that, they tried to add the valid warrant clause, and that seemed like a really good barrier towards misuse, and they didn't allow it.
Yeah, it does seem to be a weird power grab. And as Iain pointed out, wrapped up in some really important stuff, we do need to secure the networks. I mean, there are problems. There are problems for national security issues, but there are also problems for corporate issues. We need to make sure that our critically important communications infrastructure is protected. But just because there's a problem doesn't mean anything that you think of is a solution.
Yes.
And this is a bad solution to a big problem.
Yes.
Ian, do you see this affecting non-American users as well?
Oh yes, totally. I'm sure there may be stuff in the bill that is only for American users. I've been going through it and I couldn't spot anything on there, but potentially it's any user of a company who is based or has activities in the US, and we saw this with the Patriot Act as well. If you're running your cloud systems in the US, then the government has automatic right to anything in there under the Patriot Act, and a lot of companies just aren't going to buy American cloud provision simply because of these kind of laws.
U.S. laws, when it comes to the internet space and communication space, almost always affect people around the world because everybody uses U.S. technology and U.S. communication systems.
I mean, it was interesting. There's a company called Silent Circle that have just started this sort of totally secure email and voice transmission. They can't base their servers in the U.S. because of the laws. They have to base them in Canada and Switzerland in order to guarantee their users' security.
Yeah.
And why do you think Microsoft and Facebook is supporting this?
Well, Facebook said that the reason they were doing it was because it had the voluntary provision and they would never ever give their customers data over there. In fact, under the terms of, I think the main reason why so many firms are actually lobbying for this is because it's a lot less trouble for them than compared to other legislation, and it gives them total legal indemnity. I mean, they can basically break every single term and condition in their user agreement, and they're legally completely free and easy. So I'm sure their legal departments love this one.
Do you think the legal implication is why as well?
You know, it's hard to know. It's hard to know. I mean, certainly big internet corporations are getting bigger and bigger presence in Washington. They need to. This is, you know, they're going to need to have a lot of friends in Washington as they get bigger and bigger. You know, it's hard to speculate what they're thinking, but it would make sense to me that there might be some things that they'd agree to, even if they don't love, because they might need some support later.
Yeah. No, that's it to say. Flawed legislation, but from a corporate perspective, there's no oversight from there on them as well. So, and they've got full legal indemnity as it stands.
So is that the worst case scenario?
Well, well, I mean, it could have been a lot worse. I mean, if they're starting to talk about having government-mandated cybersecurity setups within companies that was originally touted with bills of this kind, that's a recipe for disaster as well, because if you've got a codified security setup, that's the first thing any hacker's going to break, and once they've broken it once, they break it across the entire board. But
yeah, and I'd like to say the worst case scenario is the bill actually passing the Senate and Obama signing it, you know, because he's already threatened to veto unless privacy has been cleaned up a little bit. There's some signs that things may be a little saner in the Senate, that we might get a better bill. So, you know, EFF spent the week sort of, you know, rallying the troops to try to, you know, shoot down the bill in the House. We didn't succeed on that, but it's not over yet. Now we have to go to the Senate.
So what can concerned citizens do in order to keep this from passing?
Well, we have instructions on our website, actually. The thing that people keep telling us is that phone calls are the best. We have tools that will let you email your lawmakers, but the best thing to do is to pick up the phone. And there's instructions as how to do that on EFF's website and many other sites. I mean, we aren't the only activist group that's working to protest CISPA. I mean, there's tons of groups that are working on it. But, you know, call your senator's office and let them know how you think. And many groups, EFF and others, have suggested scripts.
I mean, there's an old adage in politics that, you know, if somebody sends you a letter, that's the equivalent of them telling 10 people about this job. If they actually give you a call personally, it's the equivalent of them telling 100 people in terms of how importantly they deal with it. And the only way that you're going to get legislation which fits what you're after is to get involved in the process. Actually call these people up, write them emails, write them letters, and let them know exactly what the situation is.
Of course, government isn't the only abuser of power. Google has taken advantage of recent case law in licensing and has announced that they're forbidden users from reselling or loaning their Google Glass eyewear. What's Google afraid of?
Well, I've got to say, it does have, I don't quite agree with them doing it, but it does have one major advantage. There's going to be people walking around with $1,500 worth of hardware on their face, and it's going to be a mugger's dream. So this will at least stop mug stuff going online. But it's, I don't know, it seems excessively harsh. I mean, from your perspective?
You know, I mean, one level, it's hard to get worked up over Google Glasses. You know, may I never wear them. But, you know, it just, you know, my life is digital enough already. But you know, you mean an interesting point, you know, when you in your introduction, which is that there's this movement for us to be renting everything instead of owning it. I mean, and the question is, how much do we have to pay to own something? Yeah. You know, when do we own our phones? Is a
our music,
our music. You know, particularly if it's hosted on a server somewhere. You know, I'm still fighting the ebook trend because I still don't know if I own that thing if I buy it.
Yeah. Or if you can keep it. I mean, they can remotely delete it from your collection without you having any kind of say in it.
And what if I want to move it to something else? I know my paper book will come with me. It's heavy, but I also know
it doesn't require batteries and it's always going to be there for you.
And I can loan it to my mother.
That's a very good point, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I was really thinking about is that, I just gave Google $1,500. Do I actually get anything out of it? Do I actually own anything after that transaction?
Right.
Well, this is it, but it's not a new problem. I mean, there's a famous case of Bill Gates back in the 80s was giving a lecture at a university, 90s, and a student came up afterwards and asked him to sign his Windows 95 CD. And his response was, no, it isn't your Windows 95 CD, it's my Windows 95 CD, read your terms and conditions.
Wow.
And it's,
that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's classic Bill, but it's just, there is a really worrying trend, though, in that we don't own anything anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a big gamer, and from a gaming perspective, the SimCity disaster showed that companies are driving us on towards you must be online all the time, and it's purely to stop piracy and ensure control over the content. There's no gameplay needed for single-play games online, but you don't own the game anymore. I'm not going to spend $70 on a game I don't own.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those situations where we need to think about the future we want and vote with our dollars.
Yeah.
So have we reached that point where hardware licensing and software licensing are basically the same contract?
There are exceptions. It's still possible to buy your mobile phone, for example, and just take it to a vendor and get them connected up, and it takes you out of the 2-year contract deal. But it's becoming increasingly rare, and more so with software, but with hardware as well. I mean, glass is a very worrying trend for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think people need to be very careful about where they spend their money and think about how they want their future. Do they want to buy stuff, or do they want to rent everything all the time?
Yeah.
And I know you've said that you're not into the Google glasses. Are you thinking about getting one?
I was at the Google I/O conference last year when they offered them for sale, and I did pitch it to my boss to get one. He shot it down, and I was going to pitch it to my wife, and it was just like explaining that we can't go to Hawaii for our honeymoon because I bought a pair of glasses is not going to go down well. So maybe not. But I don't know. I'd be interested to try them. I suspect they could be highly annoying, however.
Let's move on to another tech company in the limelight. Twitter's new standalone music discovery app/service is out. Have either of you tried it?
I haven't.
I must admit, I've been up to my neck in Boston stuff over the last 24 hours, but it certainly sounds like an interesting play. I mean, Twitter's an odd firm in that respect. They didn't go in for the big IPO splurge that we saw with the social networks. They're still very much carving out their niche. I think it's an interesting idea, certainly. It has potential, and viral marketers are going to love this one.
It's when you see the numbers of how many people get their music from YouTube, which is not something any of us would have imagined in 2005, 2006, whenever it was that YouTube started. I mean, we didn't imagine where that would go. No. I mean, I have to admit, the first time I saw that story, I was like, really? Music on Twitter? And then I started thinking a little bit, saying, no, it's music everywhere, actually. And I do have like slightly obscure music tastes, and so I do kind of follow some people who may point me in the right direction of because I'm not gonna get it in another way. So perhaps it might be something that I might be interested in.
Yeah.
So is there room for another music discovery tool? I mean, we've got a lot of apps that are already sort of aggregating this kind of stuff. Is this on the leading edge, or is it a couple steps behind?
Well,
I have to say, I get like adopting new product fatigue. A lot of people don't, but I do. And so the idea that it would be incorporated in a tool I already use, probably too much. That would actually increase the chance that I would use it, not decrease.
I suspect we're going to see also initially a huge spamming out of stuff on it, which may well turn people off, because it's just, there's only so many links you'll click through, and no, that's a really duff bit of music, or if you've got friends and you know their tastes, even then it can be a very risky business in finding out that yes, they really do like Parliament of Funk.
It seemed like a really weird step for me. It's like a couple steps back in the way MySpace went to music. I mean, is this something that Twitter's going to be able to make money on?
Whoa, well,
I still don't know how Twitter's going to make much money at all. So
exactly. I'm glad you said it, because I was just like, is that too rude?
I'm not a business person. My background's in journalism and in free speech and privacy rights. It's not business, but it still confuses me.
I've got to say, I can't see the business plan behind this, but this is probably why I'm not living in a fantastic swish mansion down in Silicon Valley and just concentrating on life here.
It seemed like the only business plan I could think of, and I'm not a business person either, was that advertising is going to be the way that it's going to go. And then at that point, is that something that I really want to engage in if it's really just going to be whoever's paid the most money
Right.
to be the most visible to me.
We're seeing the same thing with Facebook with their kind of sponsored posts as well. I think it'll turn people off. I mean, I don't know about you, but
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I'm definitely spending less time on Facebook, sort of the more ads that go up. One of the things that I like about Twitter is I go through an API where I don't see their ads.
yeah.
So,
All right, let's move from playlists to porn. In a bid to keep citizens safe from online smut, the Chinese government seeks chief pornography officer. The job description is to research and study pornographic videos, images, and formulate criteria for determining obscenity and track its use and distribution. Sounds like a dream job.
Oh, sounds like an awful
I can't
job.
imagine anything more horrible.
I was going to say, I mean, it's just having to sit there day after day just looking through this stuff would drive you insane, surely.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like this one person is going to be the gatekeeper from destroying a country. What about that one guy?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I had to do comment moderation at one point in my life,
Ooh,
and it
yes.
almost broke me. And that was what I thought when I saw this, was like, wow, if there's anything worse than comment moderation, it's porn moderation. And of course, it's hopeless, right? Porn always gets through.
Well, this is it. I mean, I knew someone who used to work on a top shelf magazine, as we called them back in the UK, and he quit after barely a year because it was negatively impacting his relationship.
Oh, yeah.
He hated what he did for a living. It was just desensitizing him the whole time. Also, for the kind of money they're offering, not a chance in hell. I mean, $32,000 a year to do this. No way. You'd have to pay me at least 6 figures.
Yeah, I just would never.
Well, it seemed like it got the most application, that there was really a flood of people that wanted to do this job. Do you think they see it as like, yippee, I get to look at porn all day? Is there another incentive there?
I think high-paying jobs are hard to come by in China.
Yeah.
I mean, that was my first thought.
This is it. I mean, I did see a report with one chap who tried to get it, and they're actually asking for a very unique skill set and multi-language, knowledge of case law on obscenity and on internet rights, and a whole variety of personnel skills. And he said he'd done an online test and I didn't think that he was going to be successful. It's obviously a very tough job. It's they're looking for the right sort of people, but. Really, I mean, and any time I worry about my job, complain about my job, I just think, yeah, some poor devil in China's got to be looking through page after page of this stuff, and yeah, it's not so bad. Get back to work.
Right.
Yes.
China's really known for having their great firewall up. Is this the sign that there are cracks in the wall?
I think it's probably more likely a sign that the wall doesn't work particularly well.
Yeah.
I mean, that it's so hard to filter stuff. You always end up filtering important things that people should have access to, blocking things that people should have access to, and then letting through things that you don't want to let through. It's a fool's game, and you're going to lose.
Yeah, I mean, there really is nothing you can do about it. It's Rule 34. It'll always be there. Certainly, having used the internet behind the Great Firewall when on visits over there, it doesn't block out. I mean, you can always find what you're looking for in there if you're a little bit smart, or if you're using Tor, or I mean, there are a whole variety of tools to get around this sort of thing. But I think what they're trying to do is not. They obviously know that they're not going to stop pornography and other political materials as well, reaching the really tech-savvy people. What they're after is blocking it for the vast majority of people whose sole understanding of technology is how to turn the thing on. So. No pun intended, actually, considering the topic matter. But I mean, you're really aiming for the low-hanging fruit, the vast majority of users who aren't going to have the technical knowledge to get around this. But as you say, porn always gets through. You can't defeat it.
Given that goal, I mean, do you think one person is enough to filter all this out?
I'm presuming they're using some kind of automated checking. You can get software automation checking, which will take out the vast bulk of it. But also, you're coming down to one person's opinion. For example, as sort of is softcore pornography really pornography as you would see it? Is somebody who's, I mean, we've had this problem with people getting their films developed back in the day.
Right.
Is taking pictures of your children in the bath pornography? Some people will say it is. Some people say it isn't. And there's no definition of pornography in Chinese law, so it's coming down to a very small number of people who decides, what is safe and acceptable viewing.
I will say the one part of the story that I thought was actually promising was the idea that, you don't trust a machine to make
Yes.
these subjective decisions. I mean, one of the things that is really important in social networking sites, when there's always these questions about what should we block, what should we not block, which they have a right to do as a private company and not a government. Should Facebook block the breastfeeding photos? And you see kerfuffles about that one almost once a week. That it is really important in those discussions to get a human involved.
Yes.
To have it not be a filter, because that's when you get weird stuff like the New Yorker cartoon getting taken down. That always stinks of machines.
You've got to have a layer 8 in there, which is just the humans. Computers are fantastically good at doing a whole variety of things, but they're incredibly stupid in other ways, and you do need that human oversight.
Yeah.
All right, that's all the time we have for this episode. I'd like to thank Iain and Rebecca for joining me today. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, just post them below in the YouTube comment section. Until next time, you've been watching Downloaded.